Jennifer Kirk, we welcome you back to our initiative, Parenting in Lockdown. We thought that today we would talk a little bit about regulating babies. We know that it's not an easy time to be a mom with a baby at home, locked in. And we thought maybe we could offer a little bit of guidance around how to regulate your baby in this kind of environment.
Great. So thanks for having me on again. I think this is a really important discussion to be having, because I think that what's happening in these times is very different to what's happening in other times. I think as parents, we're feeling overwhelmed by the fact that we're having babies in lockdown. We're now at home. What are we doing with them? And so just being able to identify in the babies what's going on and what their needs are in these times, and also being able to identify what's happening with ourselves in these times.
Absolutely.
Really
keep coming back to that, the importance of being able to recognize what kind of state am I in. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were talking about before is the idea that there are all these different schools of thought about what babies need, and some quite kind of extreme in terms of you've got your Gina Ford, and you've got your moms that are very much, we only cuddle and we all together and we never separate. And I think sometimes it's quite hard for mom to tease out what's right for my baby. One of the things we were talking about is the idea that, in fact, babies are different. And I think that sounds so obvious, but I don't think it always is for parents who are looking for kind of guidance around what are we meant to be doing here.
Exactly.
One of the things we were talking about is that babies have different thresholds, different sensory thresholds, different bodily regulation thresholds. My tummy works well. Actually, no, I'm struggling a bit. I can manage this amount of regulation. I can manage this amount of sensory input. And sometimes parents don't always realize that different babies need different things.
Yeah. So I think that you just hit the nail on the head in terms of there are so many different approaches. And why are there so many different approaches? And one parent will say, this approach works brilliant for my one child, and this approach doesn't work for my other child. Or this approach worked really well for me, you should try it. And then a parent tries it, it doesn't work, and they feel like a failure. And I think at the end of the day, every child is so different. And there's not one approach that's going to work perfectly for every child, unfortunately. And I think maybe what we can talk about today is how to identify what your child needs, and maybe some cues that your child is giving, because it's exactly right that every child has different thresholds. So we need to look at the capacity of the child. Maybe a child, particularly a child who's born a bit prim, their capacity is going to be a lot less, and the amount of input that they're going to need from the parents is going to be so much more. Whereas another child might be able to just cope with so much sensory input. So I think where to start is maybe to talk about identifying your child's threshold. And what's really important is for you to be able to identify when a child is reaching, it's all getting too much, and maybe now we need some input to calm down. So babies obviously give us a lot of cues, and it's about identifying those cues before they get too dysregulated, and being able to step in and using a technique that then works for that child. Not all techniques work for every child. So to start, it's to identify, usually when a baby's in that awake, alert state, they're engaging, they're learning, they're taking in all the information from the world, but what happens is they start to slowly it all gets a bit too much, and they now need some regulating input. Those cues tend to be that you'll start to notice in the child, and initially they're very subtle, and it's about picking those up quite quickly, because then you can help the child to regulate so they don't get too far gone. And those cues tend to be things like you'll start to see the child will start to get a bit more niggly. They're just not feeling very comfortable in their body. Their movements become a little bit more erratic. And sometimes when you're playing and trying to engage with them, they'll look away because it's almost just getting a little bit too much. We might have a yawn. We might get a little bit of the hiccups. Our body's just saying, it's now time for me to settle down and calm down a little bit.
Breathing changes. Suddenly your baby starts breathing much more quickly.
Absolutely. So we'll get the breathing, we might get a few moans and groans that I'm not feeling happy, I need something. And that tends to be when parents step in, they can do a little bit just to bring their babies down. And what we want them to just bring them down a little bit according to what they need. Some children might go from, we might get a little bit uncomfortable, and then suddenly we all off the walls and now we're screaming. So it's really about jumping in when that child needs it, bringing them down with whatever sensory input we can get them to come down, and either they need to go to sleep or they just need some calming. Maybe we take them out of the overwhelming sensory world because that's too much. So that's really about identification. Right. It's about reading your cues first.
And I guess important to say that I think some babies are seen as being easy. You'll hear parents talking about easy babies, but I think really what easy babies are babies that take a lot longer to get to that dysregulated point. So, and I mean, Jen, you and I've worked with lots of babies. We've seen newborns, even in a kind of Caesar ward, who can manage, they're quite robust and they can manage quite a lot of input before they get to that stage. Other babies who mums will say, I've got such a difficult child, or, my child cries all the time, might actually just be a child who manages less before they get to that point. And yet what we know is that if parents can recognize those cues just a little bit earlier before they hit the crying stage, that actually those babies who seem more difficult can be calmed in the same way. We just know that maybe they need a little bit more protection from being overwhelmed, but also that they reach that point a little bit faster. And so parents have got to be a little bit quicker on the ball in terms of picking that up.
Exactly. And I think that can be really hard when we're all at home, when maybe you've got other siblings, you're all in the same house, maybe even in the same room. And it's really hard to be able to protect that baby from getting to that point. So it's really about, as you say, particularly for the babies that reach that point a little bit quicker, it's about how do we identify that a little bit sooner before the wheels fall off. And if we can identify that a little bit sooner, what will happen, it's not to say that those babies will be like that always, that their capacities will be able to be improved. But what we need to be doing is we need to successfully identify when they're reaching that point, help them to calm down. And what will happen slowly with that successful identification is that then their capacity will just get bigger and bigger and bigger.
But what that does mean is that mums and dads will have a bit of an easier time because they have a baby who's now more regulated.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
And
sorry?
I was going to say, you mentioned earlier that in a lockdown period, I mean, here we're talking about regulating, calming, making sure you catch it in time. What about the other side of things? I know you had kind of suggested that was also something that was worrying you. What about parents making sure that the kids are getting enough?
Absolutely. So I think that's also a big worry for me at the moment, is that we are protecting our babies. We're protecting, and on the reverse side, we're at home with our babies, we're having this beautiful quality time, but we are protecting them a little bit from the world outside. And what's going to happen when we suddenly now go into this big wide world and we're going to have all these babies that are just completely overwhelmed from a sensory perspective? So I think it's really important to be aware as parents to be able to bring in some of that sensory information. So not forgetting the tactile input, the messy play, trying to get the babies just to feel different textures and to cope with noises when they're able to. So when they're in that just right state, in that calm alert state, when they're wanting to get more, is being able to give them a little bit more. So being able to give them a little bit more noise, being able to give them a little bit more movement, maybe having some, if we can, having the whole family together at some point when they're able to cope with it, playing with some sand, playing with some different things that we have at home. So being able to expose them to the sensory input while we're still in lockdown, so that we're not just overloading them when we do get out.
Right. So I mean, what you're saying is for those babies that need to be protected, we have to be doing that. We'll have an easier time, they'll have an easier time. But for babies that can manage, actually it's quite important that they are exposed to noise, to sound, to different colors and textures, and that mothers shouldn't necessarily feel that they have to protect their babies from that. Actually, as babies kind of advance and grow and expand what they can manage, in fact, it's very important that they are exposed.
Yeah. So as we said from the very beginning, it's about reading the baby. It's about reading, are they now able to be exposed? And when we expose a child to more sensory input, we don't just bombard them with, here's a rattle and here's some noise and here's this and here's some different colors. We expose them very slowly and very gently, just so that they can actually interpret what that sensory information is, and trying to do one or two things at a time. So if it's some noise, so that they can work out, oh, what is that noise? Where's that noise coming from? All the dimensions of that. And then moving on to the next thing. And maybe the baby can only cope with one thing for that moment, and then they might need some calming, they might need to go to sleep, and then when they wake up again, maybe they can be exposed to something else or something for a little bit longer. But it's definitely about reading the baby, reading what they're capable of, and if for that day they're not capable of anything in terms of any new sensory exposures, then that's okay. Maybe also being aware that some days we have difficult days, and maybe it's a day where as a parent we're feeling a little bit anxious and baby's just not settling as quickly as they were settling before. Being okay with that and saying, okay, well, I'm not having a great day, maybe my baby's picking up on that, let's just have a very calm day today, we just need calming. And then the next day, maybe now, okay, well, now they're ready to have a little bit more sensory exposure. So every day will be a little bit of a different day, but being okay with whatever your baby and what you need on those days.
Right. And I think, again, we keep coming back to the fact that parenting's hard. Parenting in lockdown is particularly hard. And I suppose it needs thoughtfulness, it needs awareness. We keep coming back to the same words. And a lot of parents are going to need support in doing that. And I think important that we keep the message we keep wanting to get out there is reach out for support if that's what's needed.
Yeah. And forgiveness too, forgiveness on ourselves, because as you say, parenting is hard. Parenting without lockdown is hard. And parenting in lockdown is another challenge. It's another, we don't know what, this is all new territory for all of us. So being okay with the fact that it's hard, being okay with the fact that we don't all know, and therefore, as you say, being able to reach out to people and getting support when we need it.
Right, absolutely. Jen, thank you so much. I think that's really important advice. And we look forward to having you on again.
Thanks for having me.